Hello, everyone. Tonight, we return with another chilling collection of accounts that have been deliberately buried beneath layers of silence and deception. In this episode, we will dive deep into the shadowed corners of small-town America with 8 harrowing tales of secret societies operating in plain sight, controlling entire communities through fear, manipulation, and unspeakable acts. These organizations may present themselves as harmless civic groups, historical societies, or charitable foundations. But behind their respectable facades lies a darkness that has claimed countless innocent lives. Each story you are about to hear has been meticulously researched and compiled from witness testimonies, leaked documents, and survivors who risked everything to expose the truth. The names, locations, and individuals have been carefully altered to protect those who courageously came forward, as many of these secret societies continue to operate with impunity to this day. From the rolling hills of Vermont to the plains of Kansas, these clandestine organizations have woven themselves so deeply into the fabric of their communities that questioning their authority has proven fatal for many who dared to investigate. Harold Brennan had been planning his photography trip to the Great Smoky Mountains for over a year. At 38 years old, he had built a modest career as a nature photographer, selling prints online and occasionally landing assignments with outdoor magazines. The Smokies in mid-October were legendary for their autumn colors, and Harold had carefully researched the best locations for capturing the fall foliage at its peak. The Appalachian Trail section through the park offered some of the most spectacular vistas, and Harold had planned a 5-day trek that would take him through the highlands, where the elevation provided sweeping views of the mountains rolling away in every direction. He started his hike on a Wednesday morning, his pack loaded with camera equipment, extra batteries, and enough food to last him through the weekend. The weather forecast called for clear skies and unseasonably warm temperatures, perfect conditions for photography. Harold made good progress on the first day, stopping frequently to set up shots, experimenting with different angles and lighting. By late afternoon on the second day, he reached Spencefield, a high-elevation grassy bald that offered 360-degree views of the surrounding peaks. The shelter at Spencefield was a simple 3-sided structure, typical of the shelters throughout the Smokies. When Harold arrived around 5 in the evening, he found 3 other hikers already settled in for the night, a couple from Ohio and a solo hiker from Virginia. They exchanged the usual pleasantries, shared information about trail conditions, and prepared their dinners together. Harold mentioned that he planned to camp in his tent rather than sleep in the shelter, wanting the flexibility to wake early for sunrise photography without disturbing the others. As they ate, the conversation turned to the peculiar reputation of Spencefield. The solo hiker, a man in his 60s who had been hiking there for years, mentioned casually that many hikers avoided staying in this particular area if they could help it. When Harold asked why, the man shrugged and said that the place had a bad reputation, though he was vague about the details. The couple from Ohio exchanged glances, but said nothing. Harold laughed it off, assuming it was just typical trail superstition. Every popular hiking area had its ghost stories and urban legends. By 7 in the evening, the other hikers had retreated into their sleeping bags. Harold set up his tent about 50 yards in the shelter, choosing a spot that would give him an unobstructed view of the eastern horizon for the sunrise. The evening was remarkably warm for October, and he left his tent flaps partially open to let in the breeze. As darkness settled over the mountains, a thick fog began rolling in, moving across the grassy field in slow, undulating waves. Harold watched it for a while, considering whether it would interfere with his morning photography plans, then eventually crawled into his sleeping bag. He was not sure what time it was when he woke, but the darkness was complete. His watch showed 11:17. Something had pulled him from sleep, some sound that his unconscious mind had registered as wrong. He lay still listening, trying to identify what had disturbed him. Then he heard it again, the sound of children laughing. The laughter was clear and distinct, multiple voices, the carefree sound of kids playing a game. But there were no children on this isolated section of trail, no families camping nearby. Harold unzipped his sleeping bag and moved to the tent entrance, peering out into the fog-shrouded field. The visibility was terrible, perhaps 15 feet at most. The fog had thickened considerably, turning the landscape into a formless gray void. But the laughter came again, closer now, from somewhere out in that fog. Harold called out, his voice sounding strange and muffled in the dense air. "Hello, is everything okay?" Stopped instantly as if someone had flipped a switch. The silence that followed was absolute, more complete than any silence Harold had experienced. No insects, no wind, no distant sound of the forest, just an emptiness that felt somehow hostile. He waited, his heart beginning to pound, wondering if he should go back to the shelter and wake the other hikers. Before the laughter started again, but this time it came from multiple directions simultaneously. Voices were circling him, moving through the fog in patterns that Harold fumbled for his headlamp. He swept it back and forth across the field, trying to locate the source of sounds. For just a moment, he caught sight of something moving at the edge of his light's range, small shadows that darted quickly out of view. They were child-sized, low to ground, moving with an odd, skittering quality that did not look quite right. He called out again, his voice less steady now. "Who is out there? This is not funny." The response was immediate and chilling. A voice spoke from directly behind his tent, so close that it seemed impossible he had not heard someone approach. The voice was an adult's voice, deep and masculine, but it whispered his name, Harold. Just that, nothing more. His full name, spoken with perfect clarity by someone or something that should not know who he was. Harold spun around, his light sweeping across the area behind his tent. There was nothing there, just grass and fog and the dark line of trees 50 feet away. He scrambled backward, retreating into his tent, and zipped it shut with shaking hands. This was not right. None of this was right. He grabbed his hiking poles, the only thing he had that could serve as a weapon, and sat in the center of his tent, listening. The footsteps started a few minutes later. They circled his tent slowly and deliberately. The sound of feet moving through grass, except that the footsteps sounded wrong. There were too many of them, and they did not follow a normal walking rhythm. Harold counted at least 6 or 7 distinct sets of footsteps, all moving around his tent in a slow, synchronized circle. He wanted to scream, wanted to run to the shelter, but some instinct told him that leaving the tent would be a terrible mistake. Then the voices began. They started as whispers, dozens of overlapping whispers in different tones and pitches, speaking words Harold could not quite make out. The whispers gradually grew louder, resolving into recognizable sounds. And Harold realized with mounting horror that the voices were repeating things he had said earlier. Fragments of his conversation with the other hikers played back in perfect mimicry. His own voice discussing his photography plans, his concerns about the weather, his casual goodbye to the others. But the voices were not quite right. They had a hollow quality, like recordings played through damaged speakers. Harold pressed his hands over his ears, trying to block out the sounds. But they seemed to come from inside his head, as much as from outside the tent. The circling footsteps continued, never pausing, never stopping. Hours passed, though Harold had lost all sense of time. His watch showed midnight, then 1 in the morning, then 2. The voices never stopped their horrible mimicry, cycling through everything he had said, sometimes playing phrases backward, sometimes overlapping multiple recordings, until they became a chaotic cacophony. At some point after 2 in the morning, the tent zipper began to move. Harold watched in frozen terror as the zipper slowly, deliberately opened from the outside. He had locked it. He was certain of that. Tab moving smoothly down as though pulled by invisible fingers. Through the widening gap, Harold could see the fog outside, but there was nothing else visible. No hand, no person, nothing to explain how the zipper was moving. Then he saw the hand. It reached through the opening. Fingers that had too many joints. The fingers bent at angles that human fingers could not achieve, flexing and stretching as they groped inside the tent, searching. Harold kicked at the hand with all his strength, connecting solidly with what felt like cold, rubbery flesh. The hand withdrew instantly, and the tent zipper snapped shut again. Immediately, the voices outside changed. They stopped their mimicry and began to scream. But it was Harold's scream they were making. His own voice, his own terror, played back at him from a dozen sources at once. The sound was overwhelming, disorienting, and Harold found himself screaming too, adding his real voice to the chorus of false ones until he could not tell which was which. The screaming continued for what felt like hours. Harold huddled in his tent, hiking poles held in white-knuckled fists, convinced that he was losing his mind. But gradually, so slowly that he almost did not notice at first, the sounds began to fade. The screaming voices grew quieter, more distant. The circling footsteps slowed and eventually stopped. By the time Harold's watch showed 4 a.m, the only sound was his own ragged breathing. He did not dare move, did not dare investigate. He sat in his tent, staring at the zipped entrance, waiting for the attack to resume. But as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, normal sounds returned to the forest. A bird called somewhere in the distance. A breeze rustled the grass. The fog began to thin, revealing the familiar shapes of the landscape around him. When full daylight arrived, Harold finally found the courage to unzip his tent and look outside. What he saw made his blood run cold. The grass around his tent was covered in small handprints, dozens of them pressed deep into the earth. But these were not normal handprints. Each one had 6 fingers, and the fingers were far too long, the proportions all wrong. The prints formed a complete circle around his tent, overlapping in places, as though many small hands had pressed themselves into the ground. Harold grabbed his camera with shaking hands and photographed everything. The handprints, the disturbed grass, the entire area around his tent, his camping gear. Did not stop to make breakfast, did not even go to the shelter to check on the other hikers. He stuffed his camera and essential gear into his pack, abandoned everything else, and started hiking down the trail at a near run. He did not stop until he reached the next road, crossing nearly 8 miles away. From there, he hitched a ride into Gatlinburg and went directly to an outdoor outfitter store he had visited before starting his hike. The owner was a local man in his 70s who had grown up in the shadow of the Smokies. When Harold showed him the photographs on his camera, the man's face went. "Where did you take these?" The owner asked quietly. "Spence Field," Harold replied, "last night." "What are they?" The owner was silent for a long moment, studying the images of the 6-fingered handprints. Finally, he looked up at Harold with an expression of deep unease. Whole area before became a national park that was Cherokee land, sacred ground. There are stories about that place, old stories that most people think are just legends. The Cherokee talked about the Nunahai, the spirit people. They were supposed to be immortal beings that lived in the high places, and they could take different forms. Sometimes they appeared as children, playing and laughing, trying to lure travelers away from the trails. Harold felt his skin crawl, but the handprints, 6 fingers. The old stories described them that way. The owner said, not quite human. Cherokee avoided certain areas in the mountains because of the Nunna. Spence Field was one of those places. Some say it was a burial ground. Others say it was a doorway between worlds. Either way, it was not a place to spend the night. Harold completed his photography trip, but he avoided the Smokies entirely, choosing instead to photograph the North Carolina sections of the trail. He eventually made it to Maine and got some excellent shots, but he never went back to Spence Field. The photographs he took that morning remain on his memory card, but he never published them, never showed them to anyone except that outfitter in Gatlinburg. Years later, Harold still has nightmares about that night. He dreams of children laughing in the fog, of hands with too many fingers reaching for him, of voices that know his name. And sometimes in his dreams, he unzips his tent and looks outside to find hundreds of small figures standing in the darkness, all of them staring at him with eyes that reflect his headlamp's light. Those dreams, he always hears the same whispered invitation spoken in his own voice, calling him to join them in the fog. James Patterson had always been fascinated by genealogy, spending his weekends tracing family trees and documenting the stories of ancestors who had lived and died long before his birth. When he inherited his grandmother's collection of family documents and photographs, he decided to research the Patterson family history in depth, hoping to create a comprehensive record that future generations could treasure. His investigation led him to Blackwater, North Carolina, a small town of 1,045 residents where his great-great-grandfather had settled in the 1890s after immigrating from Scotland. Blackwater sat in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, surrounded by dense forests and rolling farmland that had changed little since the town's founding. The community had been built around a lumber mill that processed timber from the surrounding mountains, and many of the original families still owned property that had been in their possession for more than a century. Main Street retained its 19th century character, with brick buildings housing businesses that served both local residents and tourists who visited the area for its scenic beauty and historical significance. The Blackwater Heritage Foundation operated out of a restored Victorian mansion that served as both a museum and research center for anyone interested in the town's history. The foundation had been established in 1964 by prominent local families who wanted to preserve documents, artifacts, and stories that documented the community's development from a frontier logging camp into a stable agricultural town. Margaret Caldwell, the foundation's current director, was a distinguished woman in her 70s whose own family had been among Blackwater's original settlers. James was welcomed warmly when he contacted the foundation about researching his family history. Margaret Caldwell personally guided him through their extensive archives, which included birth and death records, property deeds, business ledgers, and thousands of photographs that chronicle life in Blackwater from its earliest days. The foundation maintained detailed genealogical records for most of the families who had lived in the area, creating a comprehensive database that researchers could use to trace connections between different branches of their family trees. The Patterson family records were particularly extensive, documenting 5 generations of births, marriages, deaths, and property transactions that painted a detailed picture of how James' ancestors had lived and worked in the Blackwater area. His great-great-grandfather had arrived with very little money, but had gradually accumulated land and built a successful farming operation that had supported his descendants for decades. The family had been active in community affairs, serving on church boards, school committees, and various civic organizations that had shaped the town's development. James was impressed by the foundation's meticulous record-keeping and their obvious dedication to preserving local history. Margaret Caldwell seemed to know intimate details about every family that had ever lived in Blackwater, and her stories brought the dry facts and the archives to life with anecdotes about personalities, relationships, and events that had shaped the community's character. She encouraged James to spend as much time as needed going through the records, offering to help him understand the context behind the documents he was discovering. During his research, James began to notice patterns in the foundation's records that seemed unusual for a typical small town. Certain families appear to have unusually detailed documentation, with records that tracked not just basic vital statistics, but also personality traits, talents, health conditions, and other characteristics that seemed to go beyond normal genealogical research. Some files included photographs and notes that documented multiple generations of the same families, creating profiles that resembled breeding records more than family histories. Even more unusual was the foundation's practice of maintaining what they called connection maps that trace relationships between different families going back several generations. These elaborate charts showed not just marriages and direct family relationships, but also more distant connections, including friendships, business partnerships, and other associations that had linked various families over time. The maps were incredibly detailed, suggesting that the foundation had invested enormous effort in tracking even minor connections between community members. James's curiosity was piqued when he discovered that his own family was featured prominently in these connection maps, with detailed notations about Patterson family members going back to his great-great-grandfather's arrival in Blackwater. The maps showed connections to dozens of other families in the area, creating a web of relationships that seemed to encompass virtually everyone who had ever lived in the town. Some of the notations included references to characteristics and abilities that had been passed down through different family lines, as if the foundation was tracking genetic traits across multiple generations. When James asked Margaret Caldwell about these unusual records, she explained that the foundation took a comprehensive approach to documenting local history. Understanding the connections between families was essential for preserving the full story of how the community had developed, and tracking characteristics across generations helped explain why certain families had been particularly successful or influential in the town's affairs. The foundation's mission was to ensure that future researchers would have access to complete information about their ancestors and their place in the community's history. James found this explanation plausible until he began to notice references in the Foundation's records to families who had apparently been encouraged or required to form marriages based on recommendations from community leaders. The records contained correspondence between prominent families discussing potential marriages between their children, with detailed analysis of how such unions would benefit the community's genetic heritage. Some letters were quite explicit about the goal of ensuring that desirable traits were passed down to future generations while preventing marriages that might introduce unwanted characteristics. The pattern became even more disturbing when James discovered records showing that families who refused to follow the Foundation's marriage recommendations sometimes faced social and economic pressure that forced them to leave Blackwater entirely. Property records showed that non-compliant families had often sold their land at below market prices to Foundation board members or their allies, suggesting that economic coercion had been used to enforce compliance with the community's breeding program. James realized that the Blackwater Heritage Foundation was not simply preserving local history, but had been operating a systematic program to control which families remained in the community and who they were allowed to marry. The Foundation's extensive genealogical records were actually breeding charts designed to maintain genetic lines that the organization's leadership considered desirable, while eliminating families whose characteristics were deemed problematic or inferior. His investigation revealed that this program had been operating for more than 60 years, with Foundation leaders serving as unofficial matchmakers who arranged marriages between young people whose family lines were considered genetically compatible. Children who refused to marry according to the Foundation's recommendations were often ostracized from the community, denied employment opportunities, and pressured to relocate to areas where their genetic heritage would not contaminate the carefully maintained bloodlines of Blackwater's founding families. Even more horrifying was James's discovery that the Foundation had been involved in systematic elimination of individuals whose genetic makeup was considered undesirable. The records contained documentation of suspicious deaths, unexplained disappearances, and forced institutionalizations that had removed dozens of people from the community over the decades. Individuals with physical disabilities, mental illness, or other conditions that the Foundation considered genetic defects had been systematically eliminated to prevent them from reproducing and passing their characteristics to future generations. The Foundation's activities extended beyond controlling marriages to include monitoring the health and development of all children born in the community. The organization maintained detailed records of every child's physical and mental characteristics, identifying those who showed signs of undesirable traits that needed to be addressed before they reached reproductive age. Children who were deemed genetically inferior were often removed from their families through fabricated reports to social services, then placed in institutions where they could not reproduce. James' research revealed that his own family had been participants in this breeding program for generations, with Patterson marriages carefully arranged to enhance desired genetic traits, while avoiding combinations that might produce unwanted characteristics. His grandparents, his parents, and even his own birth had been planned and approved by Foundation leaders who had analyzed the genetic heritage of both family lines to ensure that the union would produce offspring with the desired physical and mental attributes. The realization that his entire family history had been manipulated by a secret breeding program was devastating enough. But James's investigation revealed an even more disturbing truth about the Foundation's ultimate goals. The organization was not simply trying to improve the genetic makeup of Blackwater's population, but was part of a larger network that was conducting genetic experiments designed to create superior human beings for use by powerful individuals and organizations outside the community. The Foundation's carefully maintained bloodlines were actually breeding stock for a human trafficking operation that provided genetically superior individuals to wealthy clients who wanted children with specific physical and mental characteristics. Young people who had been bred according to the Foundation's specifications were systematically removed from Blackwater through fake opportunities, arranged marriages to outsiders, or outright kidnapping, then delivered to buyers who had paid enormous sums for access to genetically engineer human beings. James discovered records showing that dozens of Blackwater residents had been sold over the decades, their disappearances explained as voluntary relocations or educational opportunities that had taken them to other parts of the country. In reality, these individuals had been delivered to buyers who wanted servants, surrogate mothers, organ donors, or subjects for medical experimentation, with their genetic heritage carefully documented to ensure that purchasers received exactly what they had ordered. The Foundation's breeding program had created multiple generations of individuals who had been specifically designed to meet the demands of various markets for genetically superior human beings. Some family lines have been bred for physical strength and endurance, others for intelligence and creativity, and still others for specific physical characteristics that were valued by particular buyers. The entire community of Blackwater had essentially become a human breeding farm operated under the cover of historical preservation and genealogical research. When James attempted to expose the Foundation's activities, he discovered that town clerk Diana Foster was actually Margaret Caldwell's daughter and a key participant in the breeding program's administrative operations. Foster had been responsible for maintaining the official records that concealed the Foundation's criminal activities, creating false documentation that supported the cover stories used to explain disappearances and forced relocations. James' investigation was interrupted when he was approached by Foundation security personnel who had been monitoring his research activities. The Foundation had discovered that he was asking too many questions and accessing records that revealed the true nature of their operations. James was informed that he would need to become a permanent resident of Blackwater, where his continued research activities could be properly supervised and his genetic heritage could contribute to the community's breeding program. The confrontation with Foundation personnel convinced James that he was in immediate danger and needed to escape from Blackwater before he became another victim of their human trafficking operation. He managed to copy the most damaging records and flee the town under cover of dark, eventually reaching federal law enforcement agencies that were already investigating reports of missing persons and human trafficking activities in rural North Carolina. The FBI investigation that followed revealed that the Blackwater Heritage Foundation had been operating one of the most sophisticated human breeding and trafficking networks ever discovered in the United States. Margaret Caldwell, Diana Foster, and 19 other Foundation members were arrested on charges, including human trafficking, kidnapping, conspiracy, and murder. The investigation revealed that the organization had been responsible for the disappearance of more than 130 people over 50 years, using their genealogical research activities as cover for systematic breeding and sale of human beings. James Patterson never returned to Blackwater after testifying at the trials that eventually convicted the Foundation leadership. His genealogical research had revealed that his family's entire history had been fabricated and manipulated by criminals who had used genetic engineering to create human beings for sale to the highest bidders. The discovery that even his own existence had been planned and controlled by traffickers left him questioning everything he had believed about his identity and heritage. The town of Blackwater continues to exist, but most of the original families have dispersed to other areas where their genetic heritage is not a matter of public record. The Heritage Foundation building now stands empty. Its archive sees as evidence in ongoing investigations into the network of human trafficking operations that had used small American towns as breeding facilities for more than half a century. Growing up, my Appalachian grandmother told me stories I thought were just mountain folklore until I experienced the truth for myself. My name is Kevin O'Brien. I am from New Orleans, Louisiana, and what happened to me in the mountains of Southwest Virginia 2 years ago proved that some old legends are based on terrifying reality. My grandmother, Meemaw Sarah, had grown up in those mountains before moving south in the 1950s. And she used to tell me stories about something she called the fiddle man who played music that could drive people to madness. According to Meemaw Sarah, the fiddle man was an ancient spirit who had been roaming the mountain hollows since before white settlers arrived in the region. He appeared as a tall, thin man in old-fashioned clothes, always carrying a fiddle made from materials that no earthly craftsman could have used. She said his music was the most beautiful and haunting sound anyone could ever hear, but that listening to it for too long would steal your mind and leave you wandering the mountains forever, following the melody deeper and deeper into places where no human should ever go. She told me that her own grandfather had encountered the fiddle man in 1923 while hunting alone in the woods near their family homestead. He had followed the sound of fiddle music for hours, becoming completely lost in the wilderness, till he finally came to his senses just before dawn, and realized he had no idea where he was or how he had gotten there. It took him 2 days to find his way back home, and for the rest of his life, he would sometimes stop whatever he was doing and tilt his head like he was listening to distant music that no one else could hear. I had always assumed these were just colorful family stories, the kind of folklore that develops in isolated mountain communities where people need entertainment during long winter nights. But when Meemaw Sarah died last year, she left me her old family homestead in the mountains of Virginia, along with a letter warning me never to stay there alone after dark, especially during the months when the mountain laurel was in bloom. I am a music producer who works primarily with traditional American folk music. So the idea of owning property in the heart of Appalachian musical culture was incredibly appealing. I decided to spend a long weekend at the homestead, partly to assess the condition of property and partly to see if I could record some authentic mountain music in the area where my family had lived for generations. The homestead was located in a narrow hollow called Devil's Backbone, about 15 miles from the nearest paved road. The original log cabin had been built in the 1880s and had been expanded several times over the decades, but it had been vacant for nearly 20 years and needed significant repairs. There was no electricity or running water, but there was a good well and a stone fireplace that still worked perfectly. I arrived on a Friday afternoon in late May when the mountain laurel was indeed in full bloom, creating spectacular displays of white and pink flowers throughout the surrounding forest. I spent the day cleaning up the cabin and setting up my recording equipment, planning to spend the evening documenting the natural sounds of the mountains and maybe interviewing some of the local residents about traditional music and folklore. As the sun began to set, I built a fire in the stone fireplace and settled in with my digital recording devices to capture the ambient sounds of the mountain evening. I was hoping to record owls, night birds, and maybe some of the musical insects that are common in Appalachian forests during late spring. What I recorded instead was something that I still cannot fully explain. It started around 10 o'clock as just a faint melody that seemed to be coming from somewhere deeper in the hollow. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor playing music on their porch, but the nearest house was over 2 miles away, and the sound was definitely coming from the uninhabited forest that surrounded my grandmother's property. The melody was being played on what sounded like a fiddle, but it had qualities that I had never heard in any traditional instrument. The tone was incredibly pure and resonant, with harmonics that seemed to hang in the air long after each note was played. It was hauntingly beautiful, unlike any mountain music I had ever heard, and it seemed to blend perfectly with the natural sound of the forest around it. I immediately started recording, thinking that I had stumbled onto exactly the kind of authentic mountain music that I had been hoping to find. The melody was complex and sophisticated, clearly the work of a master musician who understood traditional Appalachian musical forms, but was taking them in directions that felt both ancient and completely original. As I listened more carefully, I began to recognize elements from ballads and fiddle tunes that my grandmother had sung to me when I was a child. But this musician was weaving them together in ways that created entirely new compositions, building musical narratives that seemed to tell stories about the history and legends of these mountains. The music continued for over an hour, and I found myself becoming completely absorbed in following the intricate melodies and variations. I forgot about everything else and just sat by the fire, listening and recording, feeling like I was experiencing something magical and unprecedented in my career as a music producer. That was when I realized the music was getting closer. What had started as distant melodies coming from somewhere deep in the forest was now clearly being played much nearer to the cabin. I could hear footsteps on the wooden porch, the slow, deliberate pace of someone walking back and forth while continuing to play. The fiddle music was now so clear and immediate that it seemed to be coming from right outside the front door. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch, expecting to meet a local musician who had heard my recording equipment and decided to share some traditional mountain music with a visitor. But there was no one there. The porch was empty, and I could see no sign of anyone in the clearing around the cabin. But the music continued, now seeming to come from different directions around the cabin, as if the musician was walking in circles around the property while playing. I followed the sound with my flashlight, trying to catch sight of whoever was creating this incredible music, but I never saw another person. The melody began to change, becoming more complex and demanding, with rapid passages that require extraordinary technical skill. But there was also something hypnotic about it, something that made it difficult to think about anything else while the music was playing. I found myself walking away from the cabin, following the sound deeper into the forest without consciously deciding to do so. I remember my grandmother's stories about her grandfather following fiddle music through the woods until he became completely lost, and I forced myself to stop walking and turn back toward the cabin. But when I looked around, I realized I could no longer see the lights from the fireplace or remember which direction I had come from. The music was all around me now, seeming to come from every direction at once. The melody was building to some kind of crescendo, becoming more intense and overwhelming with each passing moment. I felt like I was losing my ability to think rationally, becoming absorbed in the music to the point where nothing else seemed to matter. That was when I saw him. He was standing about 30 feet away, partially hidden by the shadows between two large oak trees. He was tall and impossibly thin, wearing clothes that looked like they might have been fashionable in the 1800s, a long black coat, dark trousers, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. In his hands was a fiddle that seemed to gleam with its own light, even in the darkness of the forest. I could not see his face clearly, but I could tell that he was looking directly at me while he played. The music was coming from his fiddle, but it sounded like it was being amplified by the entire forest, resonating through the trees and rocks and creating harmonics that no normal instrument could produce. As I stared at him, transfixed by the impossible beauty of the music, he began to walk deeper into the forest, never stopping his playing and never taking his eyes off me. I felt an overwhelming compulsion to follow him, to hear more of this incredible music and discover where it would lead. I took several steps toward him before I remembered my grandmother's warnings and the recording equipment I had left running back at the cabin. With enormous effort, I forced myself to turn away from the fiddle man and run back toward the homestead, using my flashlight to navigate through the forest while the music continued behind me, growing fainter but never completely fading away. I found the cabin and immediately gathered my recording equipment, planning to leave the mountains that very night despite the darkness and the rough mountain roads. As I packed my gear, I listened to some of what I had recorded earlier in the evening, and I was shocked by what I heard. The digital recording contained over an hour of the most beautiful fiddle music I had ever heard. But there was something else in the audio that I had not noticed while it was happening. Underneath the melody, barely audible, were human voices, dozens of them, singing along with the fiddle music in harmonies that sounded like they were coming from very far away. I recognized some of the voices, including what sounded exactly like my grandmother singing lullabies she had taught me as a child. But my grandmother had been dead for over a year, and the recording had been made that very evening. I drove out of the mountains that night, and I've never returned to my family's homestead. I still have the recordings, but I've never been able to bring myself to listen to them again or to share them with anyone else. Some music is too dangerous to be heard, and some family legends are based on truths that are better left buried in the past. Michelle Thompson had been looking for meaningful volunteer work since moving to Maplewood, Wisconsin, a picturesque town of 7189 residents nestled among rolling hills covered with maple and oak forests. Her husband's promotion had brought them from Milwaukee to this charming community, where Main Street was lined with well-preserved 19th century buildings, and neighbors still waved to each other from their front porches. Michelle had always believed in giving back to the community, and the Maplewood Service League seemed like the perfect organization to channel her desire to help others. The Service League had been operating for more than 30 years, providing a wide range of charitable services to families in need throughout the region. Their programs included a food pantry, emergency assistance for families facing financial crises, after-school tutoring for struggling students, and a summer camp program that served children from low-income households. The organization was highly respected throughout central Wisconsin, regularly receiving grants from foundations and government agencies that recognize their effective work addressing poverty and social problems in rural communities. Hannah Brooks, the Service League's executive director, was an impressive woman in her 50s who had dedicated her career to nonprofit work. She had founded the organization after recognizing that small towns like Maplewood often lacked the social services available in larger cities, leaving vulnerable families with nowhere to turn when they encountered difficulties. Under her leadership, The Service League had grown from a small volunteer group into a professionally managed organization with an annual budget of more than $2 million in programs that serve hundreds of families each year. Michelle was immediately impressed by the scope and effectiveness of the Service League's work when she attended her first volunteer orientation session. The organization operated out of a converted warehouse on the outskirts of town, with separate areas for food distribution, clothing donations, administrative offices, and program activities. The facility was bustling with activity as volunteers sorted donations, prepared meals, and coordinated services for clients who arrived throughout the day seeking assistance. Hannah Brooks explained that the Service League served families from a wide geographic area, including many clients who traveled from other counties to access services that were not available in their home communities. The organization had developed a reputation for providing help without judgment, offering assistance to anyone who needed it regardless of their circumstances or background. This approach had made the Service League particularly effective at reaching families who might be reluctant to seek help from government agencies or traditional charities. Michelle was assigned to work with the organization's Family Assistance Program, which provided emergency help to households facing immediate crises, such as eviction, utility shutoffs, or medical emergencies. Her role involved interviewing clients to assess their needs, connecting them with appropriate resources, and following up to ensure that the assistance had been effective. The work was emotionally demanding, but deeply rewarding, as Michelle was able to see the immediate impact of her efforts on families who were struggling to survive. During her first few weeks as a volunteer, Michelle was struck by the number of families with children who sought help from the Service League. Many of these families were headed by single mothers who were working multiple jobs, but still unable to make ends meet in an economy that offered few opportunities for people without college degrees. The children in these families often showed signs of chronic stress and malnutrition, and Michelle was moved by their resilience in the face of circumstances that would challenge most adults. Hannah Brooks seemed particularly committed to helping children, often spending extra time with young clients and ensuring that they received not just material assistance, but also emotional support and encouragement. She frequently mentioned her own difficult childhood in conversations with volunteers, explaining that her personal experiences had motivated her to dedicate her life to protecting vulnerable children from the kind of trauma and neglect she had endured. This personal connection to the work made her an inspiring leader who attracted dedicated volunteers and generous donors. Michelle's first indication that something was wrong with the Service League's operations came when she noticed inconsistencies in the way certain families were treated by the organization. Some clients received extensive assistance and ongoing support, while others were provided with minimal help and seemed to be discouraged from returning for additional services. The differences did not seem to be based on need or circumstances, as some of the families who received less assistance appear to be in more desperate situations than those who received preferential treatment. When Michelle asked Hannah Brooks about these disparities, she was told that the organization had to make difficult decisions about resource allocation, and that some families were better able to benefit from assistance than others. Families who demonstrated commitment to improving their situations and who followed the Service League's recommendations were more likely to receive ongoing support, while those who seemed unable or unwilling to make positive changes were provided with temporary help but not long-term investment. Michelle found this explanation troubling because it seemed to contradict the Service League's stated mission of helping anyone who needed assistance. She began paying closer attention to which families received different levels of service and gradually realized that the pattern was more disturbing than simple resource allocation decisions. Families with children who were particularly attractive or well-behaved seemed to receive more attention from Hannah Brooks and other staff members, while families with children who were shy, traumatized, or difficult to manage were often provided with minimal assistance. Her concerns deepened when she noticed that some of the children who participated in the Service League's programs seemed to develop unusually close relationships with staff members and volunteers. These children would arrive early for activities and stay late after programs ended, spending time in private conversations with adults who showed them special attention and provided them with gifts and privileges that were not available to other participants. Michelle recognized these patterns from her training as a teacher, where she had learned to identify potential signs of inappropriate relationships between adults and children. The situation became more alarming when Michelle discovered that the Service League maintained detailed files on all the families they served, including photographs and personal information that seemed to go far beyond what was necessary for providing assistance. The files contained observations about family dynamics, assessment of parents' capabilities and reliability, and detailed descriptions of children's personalities, appearance, and behavior. Some files included notes about which children might be suitable for the organization's special programs that were not described in any of the Service League's public materials. Michelle's investigation into these special programs revealed that the Service League was operating activities that were not disclosed to volunteers, donors, or the families they served. Children who were identified as suitable candidates were invited to participate in overnight camps, weekend trips, and other activities that removed them from their families for extended periods. These programs were described to parents as educational and recreational opportunities that would benefit children who came from disadvantaged backgrounds. But the actual activities were not documented in any materials that Michelle could access. When Michelle tried to learn more about these special programs by asking other volunteers, she encountered evasive responses and suggestions that she should focus on her assigned duties rather than asking questions about activities that did not concern her. Hannah Brooks became noticeably cooler toward Michelle after she began inquiring about the undisclosed programs, and other staff members seemed to be monitoring her interactions with clients and her access to organizational records. Michelle's breakthrough came when she was approached by a former client whose daughter had participated in one of the Service League's special programs several years earlier. The woman had been reluctant to speak about her experiences with the organization, but she had become increasingly concerned about what had happened to her daughter during the time she had spent in the Service League's care. The child had returned from the special programs changed, exhibiting signs of trauma and refusing to discuss what had occurred during her participation. The former client explained that several other families had similar experiences with children who had participated in the Service League's special programs. The children had been selected based on their vulnerability and their family's desperate need for assistance, making it unlikely that parents would ask difficult questions or make complaints about the organization's activities. Programs had provided opportunities for adults to abuse children who had no other sources of support and whose families were dependent on the Service League's assistance. Michelle realized that the Service League was operating as a front for a child trafficking and abuse network that used charitable programs to identify and access vulnerable children. The organization's reputation for helping families in need provided perfect cover for criminal activities, as parents were grateful for assistance and unlikely to question the motives of people who were providing their children with opportunities they could not afford. The detailed files maintained by the organization were actually profiles used to select children for abuse and to assess their family's likelihood of reporting suspicious activities. Her attempt to report these discoveries to local law enforcement was complicated by the fact that Police Chief Anthony Silva was a longtime supporter of the Service League, who had received several community service awards from the organization. Silva was reluctant to investigate Michelle's allegations, suggesting that she had misunderstood the Service League's activities and was making unfounded accusations against respected community members who had dedicated their lives to helping others. Michelle's investigation revealed that the Service League's criminal activities extended beyond child abuse to include systematic financial fraud that had been ongoing for years. The organization had been claiming to serve far more families than they actually assisted, inflating their numbers to qualify for larger grants and donations. Money that was supposed to provide services to needy families was being diverted to support the special programs and to pay for activities that had nothing to do with legitimate charitable work. Even more disturbing was evidence that children who had been abused through the Service League's programs were sometimes permanently removed from their families through fraudulent reports to Child Protective Services. The organization would claim that parents were unfit or abusive, providing false documentation to support their allegations and ensuring that children were placed in foster care situations controlled by Service League members. These children essentially disappeared into a system designed to make them permanently available for continued abuse. Michelle contacted federal law enforcement agencies when it became clear that local authorities were either unwilling or unable to investigate the Service League's activities. The FBI investigation that followed revealed that the organization had been operating a sophisticated child trafficking network for more than 15 years, using their legitimate charitable programs as cover for systematic abuse of vulnerable children. Hannah Brooks and 12 other Service League staff members and volunteers were arrested on charges, including child trafficking, sexual abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. The investigation revealed that the organization had abused more than 60 children over 15 years, using their positions of trust and authority to exploit families who had nowhere else to turn for help. Michelle Thompson's courage in exposing the Service League's criminal activities saved countless children from future abuse. But the experience left her permanently changed by the discovery that trusted community organizations could be used as weapons against the most vulnerable members of society. The Service League building in Maplewood still stands empty, its windows boarded up as a reminder that even the most respected charitable organizations can hide unspeakable evil behind facades of compassion and community service. The town of Maplewood has struggled to recover from the revelation that one of its most celebrated organizations was actually a criminal enterprise that preyed on children and families who needed help the most. Many residents had volunteered with the Service League or donated money to support their programs. And the discovery that their good intentions had been manipulated to enable child abuse has left the community questioning whether they can trust any organization that claims to be helping others. The children and families who were victimized by the Service League continue to deal with the trauma of their experiences, knowing that people they trusted and depended on were actually using their vulnerability to cause them harm. The case has become a cautionary tale about the importance of oversight and accountability in charitable organizations and the need for communities to remain vigilant about protecting their most vulnerable members from those who would exploit their trust and desperation. James Patterson had always been fascinated by genealogy, spending his weekends tracing family trees and documenting the stories of ancestors who had lived and died long before his birth. When he inherited his grandmother's collection of family documents and photographs, he decided to research the Patterson family history in depth, hoping to create a comprehensive record that future generations could treasure. His investigation led him to Blackwater, North Carolina, a small town of 1,045 residents where his great-great-grandfather had settled in the 1890s after immigrating from Scotland. Blackwater sat in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, surrounded by dense forests and rolling farmland that had changed little since the town's founding. The community had been built around a lumber mill that processed timber from the surrounding mountains. And many of the original families still own property that had been in their possession for more than a century. Main Street retained its 19th century character, with brick buildings housing businesses that served both local residents and tourists who visited the area for its scenic beauty and historical significance. The Blackwater Heritage Foundation operated out of a restored Victorian mansion that served as both a museum and research center for anyone interested in the town's history. The foundation had been established in 1964 by prominent local families who wanted to preserve documents, artifacts, and stories that documented the community's development from a frontier logging camp into a stable agricultural town. Margaret Caldwell, the foundation's current director, was a distinguished woman in her 70s whose own family had been among Blackwater's original settlers. James was welcomed warmly when he contacted the foundation about researching his family history. Margaret Caldwell personally guided him through their extensive archives, which included birth and death records, property deeds, business ledgers, and thousands of photographs that chronicle life in Blackwater from its earliest days. The foundation maintained detailed genealogical records for most of the families who had lived in the area, creating a comprehensive database that researchers could use to trace connections between different branches of their family trees. The Patterson family records were particularly extensive, documenting 5 generations of births, marriages, deaths, and property transactions that painted a detailed picture of how James' ancestors had lived and worked in the Blackwater area. His great-great-grandfather had arrived with very little money, but had gradually accumulated land and built a successful farming operation that had supported his descendants for decades. The family had been active in community affairs, serving on church boards, school committees, and various civic organizations that had shaped the town's development. James was impressed by the foundation's meticulous record-keeping and their obvious dedication to preserving local history. Margaret Caldwell seemed to know intimate details about every family that had ever lived in Blackwater, and her stories brought the dry facts and the archives to life with anecdotes about personalities, relationships, and events that had shaped the community's character. She encouraged James to spend as much time as needed going through the records, offering to help him understand the context behind the documents he was discovering. During his research, James began to notice patterns in the Foundation's records that seemed unusual for a typical small town. Certain families appear to have unusually detailed documentation, with records that track not just basic vital statistics, but also personality traits, talents, health conditions, and other characteristics that seem to go beyond normal genealogical research. Some files included photographs and notes that documented multiple generations of the same families, creating profiles that resembled breeding records more than family histories. Even more unusual was the Foundation's practice of maintaining what they call connection maps that trace relationships between different families going back several generations. These elaborate charts showed not just marriages and direct family relationships, but also more distant connections, including friendships, business partnerships, and other associations that had linked various families over time. The maps were incredibly detailed, suggesting that the Foundation had invested enormous effort in tracking even minor connections between community members. James's curiosity was piqued when he discovered that his own family was featured prominently in these connection maps, with detailed notations about Patterson family members going back to his great-great-grandfather's arrival in Blackwater. The maps showed connections to dozens of other families in the area, creating a web of relationships that seemed to encompass virtually everyone who had ever lived in the town. Some of the notations included references to characteristics and abilities that had been passed down through different family lines, as if the Foundation was tracking genetic traits across multiple generations. When James asked Margaret Caldwell about these unusual records, she explained that the Foundation took a comprehensive approach to documenting local history. Understanding the connections between families was essential for preserving the full story of how the community had developed, and tracking characteristics across generations helped explain why certain families had been particularly successful or influential in the town's affairs. The Foundation's mission was to ensure that future researchers would have access to complete information about their ancestors and their place in the community's history. James found this explanation plausible until he began to notice references in the Foundation's records to families who had apparently been encouraged or required to form marriages based on recommendations from community leaders. The records contained correspondence between prominent families discussing potential marriages between their children, with detailed analysis of how such unions would benefit the community's genetic heritage. Some letters were quite explicit about the goal of ensuring that desirable traits were passed down to future generations, while preventing marriages that might introduce unwanted characteristics. The pattern became even more disturbing when James discovered records showing that families who refused to follow the Foundation's marriage recommendations sometimes faced social and economic pressure that forced them to leave Blackwater entirely. Property records showed that non-compliant families had often sold their land at below market prices to Foundation board members or their allies, suggesting that economic coercion had been used to enforce compliance with the community's breeding program. James realized that the Blackwater Heritage Foundation was not simply preserving local history, but had been operating a systematic program to control which families remained in the community and who they were allowed to marry. The Foundation's extensive genealogical records were actually breeding charts designed to maintain genetic lines that the organization's leadership considered desirable, while eliminating families whose characteristics were deemed problematic or inferior. His investigation revealed that this program had been operating for more than 60 years, with Foundation leaders serving as unofficial matchmakers who arranged marriages between young people whose family lines were considered genetically compatible. Children who refused to marry according to the Foundation's recommendations were often ostracized from the community, denied employment opportunities, and pressured to relocate to areas where their genetic heritage would not contaminate the carefully maintained bloodlines of Blackwater's founding families. Even more horrifying was James's discovery that the Foundation had been involved in systematic elimination of individuals whose genetic makeup was considered undesirable. The records contained documentation of suspicious deaths, unexplained disappearances, and forced institutionalizations that had removed dozens of people from the community over the decades. Individuals with physical disabilities, mental illness, or other conditions that the Foundation considered genetic defects had been systematically eliminated to prevent them from reproducing and passing their characteristics to future generations. The Foundation's activities extended beyond controlling marriages to include monitoring the health and development of all children born in the community. The organization maintained detailed records of every child's physical and mental characteristics, identifying those who showed signs of undesirable traits that needed to be addressed before they reached reproductive age. Children who were deemed genetically inferior were often removed from their families through fabricated reports to social services, then placed in institutions where they could not reproduce. James' research revealed that his own family had been participants in this breeding program for generations, with Patterson marriages carefully arranged to enhance desired genetic traits, while avoiding combinations that might produce unwanted characteristics. His grandparents, his parents, and even his own birth had been planned and approved by Foundation leaders who had analyzed the genetic heritage of both family lines to ensure that the union would produce offspring with the desired physical and mental attributes. The realization that his entire family history had been manipulated by a secret breeding program was devastating enough. But James's investigation revealed an even more disturbing truth about the Foundation's ultimate goals. The organization was not simply trying to improve the genetic makeup of Blackwater's population, but was part of a larger network that was conducting genetic experiments designed to create superior human beings for use by powerful individuals and organizations outside the community. The Foundation's carefully maintained bloodlines were actually breeding stock for a human trafficking operation that provided genetically superior individuals to wealthy clients who wanted children with specific physical and mental characteristics. Young people who had been bred according to the Foundation specifications were systematically removed from Blackwater through fake opportunities, arranged marriages to outsiders, or outright kidnapping, then delivered to buyers who had paid enormous sums for access to genetically engineer human beings. James discovered records showing that dozens of Blackwater residents had been sold over the decades, their disappearances explained as voluntary relocations or educational opportunities that had taken them to other parts of the country. In reality, these individuals had been delivered to buyers who wanted servants, surrogate mothers, organ donors, or subjects for medical experimentation, with their genetic heritage carefully documented to ensure that purchasers received exactly what they had ordered. The Foundation's breeding program had created multiple generations of individuals who had been specifically designed to meet the demands of various markets for genetically superior human beings. Some family lines have been bred for physical strength and endurance, others for intelligence and creativity, and still others for specific physical characteristics that were valued by particular buyers. The entire community of Blackwater had essentially become a human breeding farm operated under the cover of historical preservation and genealogical research. When James attempted to expose the Foundation's activities, he discovered that town clerk Diana Foster was actually Margaret Caldwell's daughter and a key participant in the breeding program's administrative operations. Foster had been responsible for maintaining the official records that concealed the Foundation's criminal activities, creating false documentation that supported the cover stories used to explain disappearances and forced relocations. James' investigation was interrupted when he was approached by Foundation security personnel who had been monitoring his research activities. The Foundation had discovered that he was asking too many questions and accessing records that revealed the true nature of their operations. James was informed that he would need to become a permanent resident of Blackwater, where his continued research activities could be properly supervised and his genetic heritage could contribute to the community's breeding program. The confrontation with Foundation personnel convinced James that he was in immediate danger and needed to escape from Blackwater before he became another victim of their human trafficking operation. He managed to copy the most damaging records and flee the town under cover of dark, eventually reaching federal law enforcement agencies that were already investigating reports of missing persons and human trafficking activities in rural North Carolina. The FBI investigation that followed revealed that the Blackwater Heritage Foundation had been operating one of the most sophisticated human breeding and trafficking networks ever discovered in the United States. Margaret Caldwell, Diana Foster, and 19 other Foundation members were arrested on charges, including human trafficking, kidnapping, conspiracy, and murder. The investigation revealed that the organization had been responsible for the disappearance of more than 130 people over 50 years, using their genealogical research activities as cover for systematic breeding and sale of human beings. James Patterson never returned to Blackwater after testifying at the trials that eventually convicted the Foundation leadership. His genealogical research had revealed that his family's entire history had been fabricated and manipulated by criminals who had used genetic engineering to create human beings for sale to the highest bidders. The discovery that even his own existence had been planned and controlled by traffickers left him questioning everything he had believed about his identity and heritage. The town of Blackwater continues to exist, but most of the original families have dispersed to other areas where their genetic heritage is not a matter of public record. The Heritage Foundation building now stands empty. Its archive sees as evidence in ongoing investigations into the network of human trafficking operations that had used small American towns as breeding facilities for more than half a century. Marcus Whitfield had been covering small-town politics for the Burlington Herald for over 15 years, but nothing had prepared him for what he would uncover in Millfield, Vermont. The assignment seemed routine enough when his editor handed it to him on a gray October morning. The town of 847 residents had been selected for a state heritage grant worth $2 million, and the paper wanted a feel-good piece about rural communities preserving their historical character. What Marcus discovered instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. Millfield sat nestled in a valley between rolling hills covered in sugar maples, their leaves burning red and gold in the autumn light. Main Street looked like something from a Norman Rockwell painting, complete with a white steppled church, a general store with wooden floors that creaked under your feet, and houses with wraparound porches where elderly residents waved from their rocking chairs. The Millfield Preservation Society had done an exceptional job maintaining the town's 19th century charm, right down to the gas street lamps that cast warm pools of light along the sidewalks each evening. Eleanor Ashworth, the society's president, met Marcus at the town's small historical museum on his first day. She was a woman in her 70s with silver hair pulled back in a perfect bun and a kind of measured speech that suggested years of public speaking. Her handshake was firm, her smile welcoming, and her knowledge of local history was encyclopedic. She walked him through displays of Civil War artifacts, pioneer farming tools, and sepia photographs of long-dead residents whose descendants still lived in the same houses their great-great-grandparents had built. The Preservation Society had been founded in 1968. Eleanor explained, when developers from Boston had threatened to build a shopping complex on the outskirts of town. A group of concerned citizens had banded together to protect Millfield's character, eventually succeeding in having the entire downtown district listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Since then, the society had grown to include nearly every business owner and prominent family in town. They controlled what could be built, what could be renovated, and what needed to be preserved exactly as it was. Marcus spent his first few days interviewing longtime residents and photographing the pristine Victorian houses that lined Elm Street. Everyone he spoke with praised the Preservation Society's work. The town had avoided the strip malls and chain restaurants that had invaded other rural communities. Property values had remained stable even during economic downturns. Young families were moving to Millfield specifically because it offered the kind of safe traditional environment that seemed to be disappearing everywhere else in New England. But there were subtle things that began to bother Marcus as he continued his reporting. When he asked about families who had moved away from Millfield, conversations became awkward and vague. People would mention that so-and-so had decided to try their luck elsewhere or found better opportunities in the city, but could never provide specific details about where these former residents had gone or what they were doing now. When Marcus asked for contact information so he could interview some of these families for a broader perspective on the town's development, he was told that most people had lost touch over the years. The town's public records also struck him as oddly incomplete. The clerk's office had meticulous documentation going back to the 1800s, but there were strange gaps in more recent decades. Death certificates, property transfers, and even high school graduation records seemed to be missing for certain years, particularly the late 1980s and mid-1990s. When Marcus asked about these gaps, he was told that there had been a fire in the basement storage area and some documents had been damaged beyond recovery. Deputy Jim Krakowski was the only person Marcus encountered who seemed genuinely uncomfortable discussing the Preservation Society. Jim was a big man in his 40s who had grown up in Millfield, left for college and a stint in the Army, then returned home to join the small police force. When Marcus interviewed him at the tiny police station, kept glancing toward the door, and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. The Preservation Society was definitely committed to maintaining the town's character, Jim said, but sometimes their methods were a bit extreme. They had unofficial authority that went far beyond what was written in any municipal code. If someone wanted to change the color of their shutters or replace their front steps, they needed society approval. If a business wanted to update its sign or modify its storefront, Eleanor Ashworth and her committee had final say. People who ignored these unofficial rules often found themselves facing endless bureaucratic obstacles, unexpected tax assessments, or mysterious problems with their utilities. Jim told Marcus about a young couple who had moved to Millfield 3 years earlier and bought a rundown house on Maple Street. They had big plans to renovate the property, turning it into a bed and breakfast that would attract tourists interested in the town's historical character. But they made the mistake of beginning work without consulting the Preservation Society first. Within a week of starting renovations, they were cited for code violations. Their building permits were mysteriously revoked, and their contractor received anonymous threats that convinced him to abandon the project. The couple tried to fight the bureaucratic roadblocks for months, but eventually gave up and sold the house to Eleanor Ashworth's nephew for a fraction of what they had invested. Marcus asked Jim if he had investigated the anonymous threats against the contractor, but the deputy just shrugged. The contractor had never filed an official complaint, and without a formal report, there was nothing to investigate. Besides, Jim added with a bitter smile, the Preservation Society had been very generous to the police department over the years. Their annual fundraising dinner had paid for new equipment, vehicle upgrades, and even Jim's salary increases. It would be difficult to investigate people who were essentially his employers. The conversation with Deputy Krakowski left Marcus with more questions than answers, so he decided to dig deeper into the Preservation Society's finances. As a nonprofit organization, their tax records were public, but obtaining them required a formal request to the state. While waiting for those documents, Marcus drove to the county seat and spent a day in the courthouse researching property transfers and business licenses. What he found there made his blood run cold. Over the past 20 years, the Preservation Society had acquired ownership of more than 60% of the residential properties in Millfield. Sometimes these acquisitions were straightforward purchases, but more often they involved complicated arrangements where the society would buy a mortgage from a bank, then foreclose when the owner encountered financial difficulties. In several cases, the society had purchased properties from families who had suddenly decided to move away from town, often selling for well below market value, as if they were desperate to leave quickly. The pattern became even more disturbing when Marcus cross-referenced these property transfers with missing person reports from neighboring towns. At least 12 people who had sold property to the Preservation Society had never been seen again after leaving Millfield. Their families had filed missing person reports with state police, but the investigations had gone nowhere. The missing individuals had apparently withdrawn their savings in cash, abandoned their jobs without notice, and vanished without contacting relatives or friends. State police had classified these as voluntary disappearances by adults who had chosen to start new lives elsewhere. Marcus tried to contact some of these missing persons' relatives, but the conversations were frustrating and frightening. Family members were reluctant to discuss their missing loved ones, and several people hung up when Marcus identified himself as a reporter. One woman, the sister of a man who had disappeared after selling his house to the Preservation Society, agreed to meet Marcus at a diner 30 miles from Millfield. She arrived looking over her shoulder and speaking in whispers, clearly terrified that someone might overhear their conversation. Her brother had been planning to move to Florida after retiring from his job at the paper mill, she explained. He had lived in the same house his whole life, raised his children there after his wife died, and was looking forward to a quiet retirement somewhere warm. But something had changed in his final weeks in Millfield. He became paranoid and jumpy, convinced that people were watching his house and following him around town. He told his sister that he had discovered something terrible about the Preservation Society, something that put him in danger. Before he could explain what he had learned, he was dead. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but his sister had never believed that explanation. Her brother had been in excellent health, with no history of heart problems. More importantly, his body had been discovered in the basement of his house, which made no sense because he never went down there. The basement stairs were steep and narrow, and his arthritis made it difficult for him to navigate them safely. The Preservation Society had arranged for a quick cremation before his sister could request an autopsy, claiming that her brother had specified cremation in a will that no one had ever seen. Marcus left that conversation with a growing certainty that he was investigating something far more sinister than historical preservation. The missing persons, the property acquisitions, the incomplete records, and the climate of fear that seemed to permeate the town all pointed toward a conspiracy that had been operating for decades. But he needed hard evidence, something more substantial than suspicious coincidences and frightened whispers. His breakthrough came when he finally received the Preservation Society's financial records from the state. Hidden among pages of routine expenses and fundraising income was a series of payments to a company called Heritage Transport Services. These payments, totaling more than $800,000 over 5 years, were listed as restoration consulting fees, but the amounts were far too large for any legitimate consulting work. When Marcus researched Heritage Transport Services, he discovered that it was a shell company with no employees, no office, and no legitimate business operations. The company's only listed asset was a fleet of refrigerated trucks. Marcus spent a sleepless night in his hotel room trying to piece together the implications of what he had discovered. A preservation society with access to refrigerated trucks, a pattern of missing persons who had owned valuable property, and a town where asking too many questions could be dangerous. The conclusion was almost too horrible to accept, but the evidence was overwhelming. The Millfield Preservation Society was not just preserving historical buildings. They were systematically murdering residents who posed a threat to their operations, then disposing of the bodies while seizing their property. The next morning, Marcus packed his belongings and checked out of his hotel before dawn. He had enough evidence to write his story, but he needed to get far away from Millfield before publishing it. As he drove through the center of town one final time, Eleanor Ashworth stepped out of the historical museum and waved it by with her characteristic warm smile. Marcus waved back, fighting the urge to floor the accelerator and flee as fast as his car could carry him. 3 weeks later, Marcus Whitfield's expose appeared on the front page of newspapers across New England. Within hours, state and federal law enforcement agencies had launched a massive investigation into the Millfield Preservation Society. What they uncovered was even worse than Marcus had suspected. The society had been operating a sophisticated human trafficking network, kidnapping residents who threatened to expose their activities and selling them to criminal organizations in major cities. The refrigerated trucks were used to transport victims who had been drugged and told they were being relocated to new jobs in other states. Eleanor Ashworth and 14 other society members were arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and organized crime. The investigation revealed that the society had been responsible for the deaths of at least 37 people over 2 decades. Many of the missing persons had not left town voluntarily. They had been murdered in the basement of the historical museum, their bodies dissolved in acid, and their property seized through forged documents. Marcus Whitfield received a Pulitzer Prize for his investigative reporting, but the recognition brought him no satisfaction. He had exposed a monstrous conspiracy, but he could not bring back the victims or undo the years of terror that had gripped Millfield. The town still exists today. Its Victorian houses and gas street lamps preserved exactly as they were, but most of the buildings stand empty now. Few people want to live in a place where a historical preservation society turned into a criminal organization that murdered anyone who threatened their perfect vision of small-town America. I had GPS, satellite phone, all the modern gear. None of it mattered when I encountered something in those mountains that seemed to understand and counter every piece of technology one carried. My name is Michael Chong. I am from San Francisco, California, and I consider myself an expert in wilderness survival and backcountry navigation. I have spent over 15 years leading survival training courses, testing outdoor equipment, and exploring some of the most remote wilderness areas in North America. What happened to me in the mountains of eastern Tennessee last fall challenged everything I thought I knew about survival in the modern age. I have been contracted by a major outdoor equipment manufacturer to field test their latest line of high-tech survival gear in extreme wilderness conditions. The equipment included a military-grade GPS unit with satellite connectivity, an emergency beacon with global positioning capabilities, thermal imaging scope night vision goggles, and a satellite communication device that could maintain contact with civilization from anywhere on Earth. My job was to spend 2 weeks alone in the most remote part of the Cherokee National Forest, testing each piece of equipment under real survival conditions and documenting its performance for potential military and civilian customers. I had chosen an area that was over 20 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by hiking through extremely rugged terrain that included steep ridges, dense forest, and multiple stream crossings. According to my topographic maps and satellite imagery, there were no established trails, no camping areas, and no record of human activity in the region for several decades. It was exactly the kind of isolated, challenging environment that would provide a thorough test of high-tech survival equipment. The first 3 days went exactly according to plan. I established a base camp in a natural clearing near a reliable water source, tested the GPS and communication equipment, and began documenting the performance of various survival tools and devices. Everything functioned perfectly, and I was impressed by how much easier modern technology made wilderness survival compared to traditional methods. The GPS unit provided precise location data and could display detailed topographic maps on a high-resolution screen. The satellite phone maintained clear communication with my support team in California, allowing me to transmit daily status reports and equipment evaluations. The thermal imaging and night vision equipment allowed me to navigate and hunt effectively even in complete darkness. I felt completely in control of my environment and confident that I could handle any emergency situation that might arise. That confidence lasted until the fourth night, when I woke up to find that every single piece of electronic equipment had stopped working simultaneously. The GPS unit was completely dead, showing no display despite having a full battery charge. When I had checked it before going to sleep, the satellite phone would not power on, and when I removed the battery and reinstalled it, the device showed error messages that were not in any manual or documentation I had seen. The thermal scope and night vision goggles were similarly non-functional, displaying only static or completely black screens. My first assumption was that I had encountered some kind of electromagnetic interference, possibly from a solar storm or military testing in the area. But when I checked my backup equipment, including mechanical devices like my compass and altimeter, I discovered that they were also malfunctioning in ways that made no scientific sense. The compass needle was spinning randomly, never settling on a consistent direction. The altimeter was showing readings that varied by thousands of feet within minutes, despite the fact that I had not changed elevation. Even my mechanical wristwatch had stopped, frozen at 3:17 a.m., which was approximately when I had first noticed the equipment failures. I spent the morning trying to troubleshoot the equipment problems, checking batteries, connections, and settings according to the manufacturer's instructions. Nothing I tried had any effect on the malfunctions. It was as if something was actively interfering with both electronic and mechanical devices, using methods that went beyond any natural phenomenon I could identify. Without GPS navigation or communication equipment, I was essentially stranded in one of the most remote wilderness areas in the eastern United States. But I had been in similar situations before, using only traditional survival methods, and I was confident that I could navigate back to civilization using natural landmarks and basic orienteering techniques. That confidence lasted until I realized that the landscape itself seemed to be changing around me. The clearing where I had established my base camp was still there, along with the stream I had been using for water, but the surrounding terrain looked different than it had when I had scouted the area during the previous 3 days. Hills and ridges that I had carefully noted on my topographic maps were no longer in their correct positions relative to my campsite. The stream was flowing in a different direction than I remembered, and several distinctive rock formations that I had been using as navigation landmarks had apparently moved or disappeared entirely. I tried to convince myself that I was simply disoriented due to the stress of having all my equipment fail simultaneously. But when I climbed to the highest point near my campsite to get a better view of the surrounding terrain, I could see that the entire landscape was subtly but definitely different from what my maps indicated should be there. More disturbing was the realization that I was being watched. I first noticed it as just a feeling, the uncomfortable sensation that someone or something was observing me from the surrounding forest. But as the day progressed, I began to catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, always just at the edge of my sight, and always disappearing when I turned to look directly. By evening, I was certain that I was being stalked by something that was deliberately staying hidden while monitoring my activities. Whatever was moved through the forest with complete silence, never disturbing the undergrowth or making any sound that would give away its position. But I could sense its presence, circling my campsite at a distance and watching everything I did. That night, I decided to use my night vision equipment to try to identify what was stalking me. But when I powered on the night vision goggles, instead of the familiar green tinted view of the forest, I saw something that defied explanation. The landscape appeared normal through the night vision device, but there were additional elements that were not visible to the naked eye. I could see what appeared to be structures in the forest, geometric patterns, and artificial constructions that occupied the same space as trees and rocks, but were somehow separate from the natural environment. More disturbing were the figures that appeared in the night vision display. There were at least a dozen humanoid shapes moving through the forest around my campsite, but they were not quite human. They were too tall, too thin, and they moved in ways that suggested their joints and limbs did not function according to normal anatomy. When I removed the night vision goggles and looked at the same areas with my naked eyes, I saw only normal forest. But when I put the goggles back on, the strange structures and figures were still there, apparently existing in some spectrum of reality that was only visible through the modified electronics of the night vision system. I realized that my high-tech equipment had not simply malfunctioned due to electromagnetic interference or equipment failure. Something had deliberately modified the devices to show me things that existed alongside the normal physical world, but were usually invisible to human perception. The entities that were stalking me were not just watching my activities. They were manipulating my equipment to demonstrate their technological capabilities and to communicate that they were far more advanced than anything human science had developed. Over the following days, the manipulation of my equipment became more sophisticated and more clearly intentional. The GPS unit began displaying locations that did not exist on any earthly map, showing coordinates that placed me on other continents or even other planets. The satellite phone received calls from numbers that had too many digits and transmitted voices speaking in languages that did not sound human. Most unsettling was when the thermal imaging scope began showing heat signatures of the entities that were stalking me. They appeared as complex geometric patterns rather than the normal human or animal heat signatures I was accustomed to seeing. The patterns were constantly shifting and changing, suggesting that these beings existed in dimensions or states of matter that human technology could only partially detect. I attempted to leave the area multiple times, but each effort resulted in becoming even more lost and disoriented. The terrain continued to shift around me, with familiar landmarks appearing and disappearing according to no pattern I could understand. My compass and GPS continued to provide contradictory information, sometimes indicating that I was moving in circles, sometimes suggesting that I was traveling in directions that did not exist on normal topographic maps. After a week of being trapped in this impossible landscape, I finally encountered one of the entities directly. It approached my campsite just before dawn, moving with the fluid, silent motion I had observed through the night vision equipment. Up close, it was clearly not human, though it maintained a roughly humanoid shape. It was over 7 feet tall with proportions that were subtly wrong in ways that made it uncomfortable to look at directly. The entity did not speak, but it somehow communicated that I was being tested to determine humanity's readiness for contact with technologies and forms of existence that were beyond current human understanding. My modern survival equipment had been modified to serve as interfaces for this testing, allowing the entities to observe how I would react to phenomena that challenged my assumptions about reality and technology. The entity indicated that I was free to leave, but that my equipment would continue to function differently than it had before, occasionally providing glimpses of the larger reality that existed alongside the normal human world. When I finally found my way back to civilization 2 weeks later, I discovered that my satellite phone had been transmitting my location accurately the entire time, according to my support team in California. From their perspective, I had simply been camping in the predetermined location, and had maintained regular contact throughout my stay in the mountains. But my equipment still sometimes shows me things that should not exist. And I now understand that human technology is far more primitive than we realize.